The Pacific, in the peak years of World War II. On the vast map of war, the United States launched an unprecedented counteroffensive along two parallel axes. In the Southwest, General Douglas MacArthur led the army step by step through New Guinea and the Solomons, advancing toward the Philippines, the land where he had once vowed, "I shall return." At the same time, from the east, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and the Pacific Fleet executed the island-hopping strategy across the Central Pacific, seizing key islands on the road to Japan. Two paths, two styles, two legendary commanders, but a single ultimate objective: the defeat of Imperial Japan. Rather than choosing a single line of advance, Washington decided to pursue both strategies simultaneously, accepting a doubling of effort in manpower, materiel, and logistics. This bold decision produced a distinctive chapter of the Pacific War, marked by spectacular victories and heavy costs alike. Why did the United States choose such a luxurious way of war? How did the parallel race between MacArthur and Nimitz unfold from 1942 to 1945? And how did these two contrasting personalities shape the course of the conflict? Let us turn back the clock and explore the two parallel strategies that helped bring World War II in Asia to an end. A journey in which war was decided not only by firepower, but by speed of advance and the capacity to absorb losses. Immediately after the disaster at Pearl Harbor in late 1941, the United States lost not only warships and soldiers, but also the initiative across the largest theater on Earth. The Pacific had become a deadly void, where American forces were forced to contract into a fragile defensive perimeter, while Japan relentlessly expanded its sphere of conquest. But by early 1942, as the initial shock faded and the American war machine began to operate at full capacity, an unavoidable question emerged in Washington: how, and from where, should Japan be counterattacked? The answer did not point to a single path. Instead, it split in two, reflecting two fundamentally different ways of seeing war, embodied by the men who stood at the head of two different services. For Douglas MacArthur, the Pacific War was not an abstract problem traced on maps, but a sequence of specific territories that had been lost and had to be reclaimed. From his headquarters in Australia, MacArthur looked north and saw a continuous landward route: New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, each a terrestrial stepping stone, leading back toward East Asia. He believed the counteroffensive had to begin from the southern approach, hugging coastlines and relying on land-based airfields to secure air superiority step by step. In MacArthur's logic, infantry needed ground to stand on, artillery needed supply routes, and air power needed permanent runways to sustain continuous pressure. This path was slower and heavier, but it offered certainty. Every piece of territory captured immediately became a springboard for the next advance. More importantly, for MacArthur, the Philippines were not merely a military objective. They were a pledge of honor left behind after the defeat of 1942. A political symbol of liberating an ally, and a strategic choke point capable of severing Japan's vital supply lines from Southeast Asia. On the opposite side of the strategic chessboard, Chester W. Nimitz viewed the Pacific in a completely different way. For Nimitz, the ocean was not an empty expanse to be crossed, but the decisive battlefield itself. Rather than crawling along a long and costly chain of landmasses, he advocated striking straight through the Central Pacific with the island-hopping strategy. In this approach, not every island was worth capturing. Only those with strategic value where airfields could be built, fleets anchored, and the operational reach of carrier aviation extended needed to be taken. Japan's heavily fortified strongholds would be left behind, isolated and allowed to wither on their own. The route through the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, Palau, and Okinawa was not about liberating territory in the traditional sense, but about shortening the distance that American bombs and shells had to travel to reach Japan's doorstep. This was a war of speed, of mobile naval power, and carrier-based air forces, in which aircraft carriers replaced infantry divisions as the central instrument of combat. The contrast between the two strategies directly reflected the contrast between the two commanders themselves. MacArthur was a man of the army who believed in the weight of land, in the principle of putting boots on the ground first and talking later, where every advance was secured by bases in the rear. Nimitz was a man of the sea, accustomed to open spaces and mobility, convinced that modern warfare allowed supposedly impregnable fortresses to be bypassed in order to strike at systemic weaknesses. One sought to strangle Japan by gradually cutting away territory and resources. The other sought to leave Japan gasping by breaking through its central defensive line and closing in on the home islands in the shortest possible time. These two paths did not negate each other, but they could not be merged into one. Advancing through New Guinea and the Philippines would protect Australia, liberate allies, and sever Japan's supply lines. Advancing through the Central Pacific promised the shortest route to carry the war directly to Tokyo. At the intersection of these two logics, the United States was forced to make an unprecedented decision, not to choose one over the other, but to accept both paths at the same time. Faced with two options of equal strategic weight, the American military and political leadership chose not to discard either, but to make a bolder decision: to pursue both simultaneously. This choice was not merely a military calculation, but the product of an intricate balance between interservice, compromise, and high-level political considerations under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As early as mid-1942, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff formally divided the Pacific Theater into two independent operational areas: the Southwest Pacific Area, under Douglas MacArthur, and the Central and North-South Pacific Area, under Chester W. Nimitz. Two parallel commands, equal in authority, both coordinated from Washington. It was, quite literally, a have-it-both-ways solution, splitting a vast ocean between the Army and the Navy to avoid an internal power struggle between two exceptionally capable commanders with sharply different personalities and strategic visions. As historians later observed, the United States conducted two parallel counteroffensives, not because it was economical, but because it could afford to do what its opponent could not: force Japan to confront two strategic thrusts at the same time. From a purely military standpoint, the greatest advantage of the dual-axis strategy lay in its dispersive and disruptive effect on Japanese defenses. With an empire stretched across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japan could only fully exploit its advantage of interior lines when facing a single main axis of advance. But when the Allies applied pressure simultaneously from the Central Pacific and from the South, Japanese commanders were forced to thin out their forces, unable to determine which direction was truly decisive. That very ambiguity created strategic gaps. American forces could strike rapidly at weak points and secure victories before Japan could redeploy troops in response. However, the strategy of fighting with two fists did not arise solely from operational maps, but from people and politics as well. Roosevelt understood clearly that both MacArthur and Nimitz were outstanding commanders, each representing a service branch with powerful backing behind him. Removing one would not only fracture unity within the armed forces, but would also waste a rare reservoir of command talent. In MacArthur's case, the symbolic dimension was even more significant. After Bataan and the bitter withdrawal from the Philippines in 1942, he had become the embodiment of wounded honor, not yet broken. American public opinion, and especially the people of the Philippines, expected his return. Roosevelt also recognized the strategic value of liberating the Philippines, not merely as the restoration of an ally, but as a decisive move to sever Japan's vital resource supply lines from Southeast Asia. On the other side, within the Navy, Admiral Ernest King and Nimitz believed that the fastest path to ending the war lay through the Central Pacific, where aircraft carriers and naval aviation could bring American power directly to Japan's doorstep. The outcome was a grand compromise: one commander, one theater, parallel offensives, shared pressure of time, and judgment rendered by results alone. Another crucial factor cannot be overlooked. The United States had the capacity to sustain this choice. After 1942, American industrial power surged at an unprecedented pace. Warships, aircraft, and new divisions poured continuously onto the battlefield. Surplus became a defining feature of the American way of war. The United States could open multiple offensives at once and maintain constant pressure in the air, at sea, and on land, something Japan, with its limited resources, simply could not match. If the Americans had concentrated on a single axis, Japan might have been able to mass its strength in response. But forced to stretch itself against multiple simultaneous advances, Japan was pushed into a state of desperate defense. In other words, the United States did not choose between options. It exploited every viable option to strangle its opponent as quickly as possible. Naturally, the cost of this choice was far from small. Two independent commands, two massive logistical chains, thousands of transport ships, and millions of tons of supplies had to be allocated across two theaters separated by thousands of kilometers. The risk of overlapping authority and wasted resources was ever present. Many senior commanders, including George Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower, expressed reservations, fearing that a two-pronged strategy might dilute the main effort, especially when the European theater was still regarded as the top priority. Yet, in practice, a different effect emerged. The quiet rivalry between MacArthur and Nimitz became a powerful driving force. Each sought to prove that his path was the decisive one, and that competition compelled both to innovate constantly, accelerate their tempo, and deny both their rival and the enemy any moment of respite. Therefore, although born out of compromise, the decision to pursue two parallel strategies opened the most ferocious phase of the American counteroffensive in the Pacific. From late 1942 onward, the two axes under MacArthur and Nimitz tightened simultaneously from opposite directions, like a massive pair of pincers slowly closing in, grinding down the Japanese empire step by step until its complete collapse. The year 1942 marked the moment the Pacific War turned, not because of a single decisive victory, but because two strategic gears began to turn at the same time. After Midway in June 1942, when the Japanese Navy lost 4 of its core aircraft carriers and its offensive momentum was halted, Washington did not wait to accumulate strength for one overwhelming counterblow. Instead, the United States chose to take a risk, to counterattack early, and to counterattack along two parallel axes. One thrust moved across the sea, the other clung to the land, both set in motion while resources were still limited, but time no longer allowed hesitation. In the central southern Pacific, under the overall command of Chester W. Nimitz, the landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942 marked the opening move of the American naval counteroffensive. It was the first time U.S. forces regained the initiative through a large-scale offensive operation, one in which aircraft carriers, the Navy, and the Marine Corps had to fight simultaneously to hold ground ashore and contest control at sea. 6 months of brutal fighting turned Guadalcanal into a grinder of men and materiel, but when the campaign ended in February 1943, the message was unmistakable. Japan no longer enjoyed freedom of expansion, and its outer defensive perimeter had been pierced. This was an axis defined by speed, by sea power, and by a doctrine aimed at striking directly through chains of key islands. Almost at the same time, in the Southwest, Douglas MacArthur launched his own counteroffensive on a completely different rhythm. In New Guinea, the Kokoda Track and Bunagona battles in late 1942 not only blocked Japan's threat to Port Moresby in Australia, but also opened a grueling infantry route through jungles and mountains. Directed from headquarters in Australia, Allied forces methodically reclaimed eastern New Guinea, building airfields, consolidating logistics, advancing slowly but securely. By early 1943, Papua had been liberated, marking the moment when MacArthur's ground-based axis was firmly established and ready to expand. What mattered was not which axis moved faster, but the fact that both existed in parallel from the outset. By late 1942 and early 1943, the Pacific map began to reveal two distinct lines of advance, one spreading northward from Guadalcanal along the Solomon Islands, the other crawling up from New Guinea along the western flank. The two paths did not overlap, yet they were not independent. They were designed to support and interlock with one another. The first point of convergence between these two parallel strategies was Rabaul, the strongest Japanese base in the Southwest Pacific. Rather than assaulting this fortress head-on, the United States applied the logic of the dual advance precisely as intended. MacArthur's forces pushed up the northern coast of New Guinea, while forces under Nimitz and Halsey successively seized New Georgia and then Bougainville along the Solomon chain. From east and west, the two axes gradually closed in, strangling Rabaul through isolation. By the end of 1943, a base once considered impregnable had been stripped of its supply lines and rendered strategically irrelevant. By early 1944, the Allies did not even need to capture Rabaul. They bypassed it entirely, leaving tens of thousands of Japanese troops trapped and neutralized by starvation and isolation. It was at this stage that the concept of two parallel strategies ceased to exist merely on paper and became an operational reality. Each axis existed to make the other more effective. Japan no longer knew where to concentrate its defenses, while the United States had demonstrated that it was willing to pay the price to advance simultaneously across both land and sea. By mid-1943, with Rabaul strangled and removed from the strategic board, the Pacific entered a new tempo. The two parallel strategies were no longer an experiment. They had become a functioning machine. While one axis clung to the land and expanded logistics step by step, the other accelerated across the ocean, selecting targets and striking directly at the core of Japan's defensive perimeter. The United States did not slow down on either front. It pressed the accelerator on both at the same time. Along the Central Pacific axis, Chester W. Nimitz began executing the strategy he had long prepared, driving straight through the island chains in the middle of the ocean. In November 1943, U.S. forces landed in the Gilbert Islands, opening the campaign with Tarawa and Macon. Tarawa, a tiny coral atoll, quickly became a stark declaration to the world. The United States was willing to pay an extraordinarily high price to open the road forward. In just 76 hours, U.S. Marines suffered nearly 3,000 casualties to annihilate the entire Japanese garrison. It was not a beautiful victory, but it was a necessary one. It proved that the sea-based axis would not be halted by any fortress, even if the path forward had to be carved in blood. Immediately after the Gilberts, Nimitz did not slow down. In early 1944, the U.S. fleet struck the Marshall Islands, capturing Kwajalein, Majuro, and Eniwetok, while deliberately bypassing stronger Japanese positions. This was the core of the island-hopping concept. Do not break down every door, only the door that leads directly to the objective. Japanese units left behind became useless liabilities, isolated in the middle of the ocean without the need for a decisive battle. Meanwhile, in the southwest, Douglas MacArthur was accelerating in his own way. If Nimitz leaped across the sea, MacArthur leaped across land. After consolidating New Guinea, he repeatedly launched amphibious landings behind Japanese lines, cutting off withdrawal routes and supply lines. In September 1943, U.S. Australian forces captured Finschhafen. By April 1944, MacArthur executed a far bolder jump, advancing more than 400 kilometers along the coast to land at Hollandia and Aitape, directly behind major Japanese concentrations at Wewake. In a single move, tens of thousands of Japanese troops were turned into stranded forces, no longer capable of conducting offensive operations. Unlike Nimitz's axis, where aircraft carriers were central, MacArthur consistently turned every captured point into a logistical foundation. At Hollandia, airfields were constructed almost immediately, transforming a landing beach into a springboard for close air support. This was the fundamental difference and the perfect complement. One side struck fast to open the road, the other built solidly to hold it. By mid-1944, the two parallel strategies had driven the United States deep forward along two very different axes. To the east, Nimitz had crossed more than half of the Pacific. To the south, MacArthur had pushed up to the doorstep of the Netherlands, East Indies, and the Philippines. In June-July 1944, Nimitz's central thrust reached a major turning point with the Mariana Campaign. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam not only opened bases for B-29 bombers, but also forced the Japanese Navy to commit its remaining strength to battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded exactly as the Americans had anticipated. Japanese carrier aviation was crushed within 2 days. Most of its elite pilots were wiped out. Additional fleet carriers were lost, and the Japanese Navy was forced into retreat. From that moment on, Japan no longer possessed control of the skies or the seas. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through Tokyo's political leadership, signaling that collapse was approaching. More importantly, from the Marianas, American bombers could now strike directly at the Japanese home islands. That same summer, MacArthur's axis did not slow in the slightest. After Hollandia, he successively captured Biak, Noem 4, and Morotai, steadily closing in on the Philippines from the south. Each advance meant a new airfield, a new supply base, and a tighter chokehold on Japan's resource lifelines. By the end of September 1944, MacArthur stood at the threshold of his long-promised return. And at precisely that moment, Nimitz's axis expanded once more to shield MacArthur's advance. From the east, U.S. Marines assaulted the Palau Islands. The Battle of Peleliu was brutally intense, with heavy casualties exchanged for a small island, but the cost had a clear purpose: eliminating the threat of Japanese air power on the eastern flank of the Philippines. By the end of 1944, the picture had become unmistakably clear. Two parallel strategies, two independent yet interlocking axes of advance, were closing in on the same rendezvous point. From the south, MacArthur advanced through land and logistics. From the east, Nimitz pressed in with naval power and air superiority. The two pincers had not yet met, but there was no longer any room left for Japan to maneuver. This was the moment when the United States most clearly demonstrated what the title of this war truly implied. It was willing to spend twice the resources in order to strike faster, tighten the noose more decisively, end one, and end the war sooner. After more than 2 years of advances along two entirely different routes, the Philippines became more than a campaign. It became the final test of America's entire strategic choice. This was the moment when the two paths, one across land under Douglas MacArthur, the other across the ocean under Chester W. Nimitz, were forced to converge. Failure here would cast doubt on the entire decision to fight in parallel. Success would prove that the United States had been right to pay double in order to finish faster. Organizationally, the Philippines campaign laid bare the true cost of parallel strategies. MacArthur held overall command on land, but for him to set foot on Leyte, Nimitz had to concentrate an immense mass of naval power at the same point. Not a single fleet, but multiple fleets. Not a single supply line, but two overlapping logistical systems. At the same time, the United States sustained an army of hundreds of thousands on Philippine soil, while also maintaining carrier forces, battleships, cruisers, and thousands of aircraft at sea. This was the clearest expression of the strategic choice itself. No slowing on either axis. No sacrificing one direction for the sake of the other. When MacArthur stepped onto the beaches of Leyte on the 20th of October 1944, the image is often remembered as a symbolic moment, but viewed through a strategic lens, Leyte was not a personal stage. It was the point of direct collision between two systems of warfare. From the moment the landing forces began expanding their beachhead, Japan understood that this was no longer a local operation. If the Philippines fell, the supply lifeline from Southeast Asia would be severed completely. And so, Japan committed what remained of its navy in a final gamble. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not a single engagement, but 4 battles unfolding simultaneously in 4 different directions. This was no coincidence. It reflected the very essence of American strategy at this stage. Strike everywhere at once, forcing the enemy to react on every plane. The Japanese Navy attempted to divide its forces to strike U.S. formations from multiple axes. But in doing so, exposed an irreparable weakness. It no longer possessed enough ships, enough aircraft, or enough trained pilots to sustain modern naval warfare. The United States, by contrast, could replace losses almost immediately. The result was that after Leyte, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a strategic force. This not only secured MacArthur's landing, but also flung open the seas for Nimitz's subsequent operations. Here, the effectiveness of the 2 parallel strategies became unmistakable. With only MacArthur, Japan might still have used its navy to harass supply lines, disrupt logistics, and prolong the fighting in the Philippines. With only Nimitz, the United States might have driven deep into the Central Pacific while leaving Japan's southern resource lifeline intact. But because both axes existed simultaneously, Japan was forced into a do-or-die naval battle to hold the Philippines. And that very battle annihilated what remained of its naval power. One axis compelled the enemy to reveal itself. The other stood ready to crush it the moment it appeared. After Leyte, MacArthur continued to apply his strategic logic, liberating Mindoro, then Luzon, and pushing into Manila. This was a war of land, of infantry, and artillery, of streets fought over block by block and reduced to rubble. The United States paid a heavy price, especially in urban battles, but in return, achieved the complete collapse of Japan's occupation apparatus in the Philippines. No ports, no airfields, no puppet administration. The Philippines were taken back from Japan not with a single swift blow, but through a prolonged, grinding, attritional campaign, MacArthur's way of war. During the same period, Nimitz did not pause to wait for the Philippines to be finished. The Central Pacific thrust drove straight toward the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima and Okinawa stand as stark evidence of the dark side of this strategy. These were small islands with little economic value, yet immense strategic importance. To seize them, the United States paid in tens of thousands of casualties. This was the direct cost of striking fast and striking deep. Yet the effect was undeniable. Every island captured tore away another layer of Japan's defenses and shortened the distance to Tokyo. By mid-1945, the 2 parallel strategies had created a condition from which Japan could not escape. In the south, it lost Southeast Asia and the Philippines, its resources, and its supply lines. In the east, it was pressed hard by American naval and air power, losing any depth of defense. In the air, cities were bombed relentlessly. On the ground, units were isolated and starved. Japan was not killed by a single decisive blow, but by being forced to fight 2 different kinds of war at the same time, and lacking the resources to sustain either. This is where the effectiveness of the parallel strategies truly lay. Japan never had a chance to recover. Whenever it concentrated forces in the south, the center was threatened. Whenever it pulled back to defend the home islands, the southern resource lifeline collapsed. There was no pause, no secondary front, and no time to reorganize. But the cost borne by the United States was equally clear. 2 parallel strategies meant 2 massive logistical chains, 2 sustained periods of heavy casualties, and 2 forms of warfare existing simultaneously. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fought at the same time in the jungles of New Guinea, on the beaches of the Philippines, on the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, and in the mud and blood of Okinawa. Had a single path been chosen, total casualties might have been lower, but had only one path been taken, the war might well have dragged on for another year or two with a price far more terrible still. That was the essence of the decision. The United States was not seeking the cheapest victory, but the fastest possible end within its capabilities. The two parallel strategies were not a sign of hesitation, but an acceptance of maximum burden in order to force the enemy into total collapse. And by the summer of 1945, when Japan surrendered, that reality was evident across the entire map of the Pacific. The parallel strategy was the product of two extraordinary yet deeply contrasting personalities, Douglas MacArthur and Chester W. Nimitz. Throughout the war, their differences were not limited to operational doctrine, but extended to leadership style, relationships with politics, and the way each presented himself to the public. It was precisely this opposition that made maintaining two parallel strategies both an immense burden and a source of strength that no single axis could have generated on its own. MacArthur was perhaps the most colorful general the United States produced during World War II. Born into a distinguished military family and having served as military governor of the Philippines before the war, he carried a powerful sense of personal mission. For MacArthur, war was not only about defeating the enemy, but about fulfilling a promise, restoring honor, and rewriting his own story. He favored grand declarations, highly symbolic gestures, and did not hesitate to place himself at the center of the stage. His 1942 declaration, "I shall return," was not merely encouragement. It was a personal vow, crafted to be remembered by the entire world. And when he did return to Leyte in 1944, the moment was carefully staged to become a piece of history. In command, MacArthur demanded absolute obedience. He wanted to grasp the entire picture and make decisions based more on personal intuition and experience than on staff consensus alone. In his view, advisors existed to supply data, but the final decision had to bear the imprint of an individual willing to shoulder historical responsibility. This approach earned MacArthur admiration for decisiveness, while also drawing criticism for authoritarian tendencies and an outsized ego. Yet that very personality suited a form of land warfare, in which the image of the commander could become a psychological anchor for a long, brutal campaign. MacArthur was also exceptionally skilled at using the media. He understood that in a global war, images and narratives mattered almost as much as firepower. Photographs of him in a peaked cap, pipe clenched between his teeth, standing on a ship's deck or wading ashore under fire, did more than record moments. They constructed a legend. Through this, MacArthur became a symbol of the liberator, not only to the American public but also to populations across Asia living under occupation. That prominence was intertwined with latent political ambition, something U.S. presidents were keenly aware of when assigning him a theater far from Washington, yet vast enough to absorb all his energy in war. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Chester Nimitz embodied a fundamentally different command style. He was modest, composed, and largely uninterested in the spotlight. Formed within a professional naval tradition, Nimitz believed in systems, organization, and collective strength rather than personal image. He was renowned for selecting the right people and genuinely delegating authority, allowing very different personalities to coexist within a unified structure. Under Nimitz's command, leaders such as Spruance, Halsey, and Kincaid had room to exercise their own styles, so long as they served the overarching strategic objective. In the conduct of war, Nimitz rarely interfered in details from the rear. He set objectives, allocated resources, and then trusted the flexibility of frontline commanders. This approach was particularly well suited to naval warfare, where speed, timing, and adaptability could determine victory or defeat within hours. Unlike MacArthur, Nimitz did not cultivate a personal public image. He appeared plainly, spoke briefly, and after the war consistently emphasized collective effort over individual achievement. That very modesty earned him deep respect among his peers. even if it sometimes left him overshadowed by more flamboyant figures. The contrast was visible even at the moment the war ended. At the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, MacArthur stood at center stage, delivered the speech, and represented the Allies before the world's cameras. Nimitz stood behind him, signing on behalf of the United States quietly and exactly in keeping with his role as a man of the institution. Those two images reflected not only personality, but two approaches to war that had run in parallel for years. The difference extended into politics as well. MacArthur maintained a complex relationship with U.S. presidents, frequently advocating his own strategic views and skillfully using public opinion as leverage. Nimitz, by contrast, kept his distance from politics and adhered strictly to the principle of civilian control of the military. In strategic debates, MacArthur often prevailed through persuasion and personal influence, while Nimitz accepted compromise when it helped preserve Allied unity. Though sharply different, these two men complemented each other in a near-perfect way. MacArthur brought political weight, symbolism, and the endurance of land warfare. Nimitz brought speed, flexibility, and the mobile power of naval warfare. It was precisely the parallel existence of these two styles that allowed the United States to sustain two different tempos of advance at the same time, forcing Japan to confront two kinds of war that it lacked the resources to withstand. When the war ended in August 1945, the outcome of this choice was unmistakable. Japan collapsed faster than expected because it was pressed from all directions simultaneously. But the United States also paid a heavy price. More than 100,000 American service members killed in the Pacific. Multiple brutal battles fought concurrently across widely separated fronts, and a vast logistical system that had to operate without pause to sustain two parallel wars. Had only one path been chosen, the immediate cost might have been lower. But had only one path been taken, the war might well have lasted longer, with consequences even more devastating. At the strategic level, the decision to maintain two parallel strategies was not merely a military success, but a declaration of American capacity and will. It demonstrated that the United States was willing to mobilize and expend resources at the maximum level to achieve its ultimate objective, while laying the foundation for its post-war dominance in the Asia-Pacific region. MacArthur and Nimitz, each in his own way, contributed to that outcome. And when one looks back on the entire journey, what remains is not only the reputations of two great commanders, but a cold strategic lesson. Sometimes victory does not come from choosing the cheapest path, but from having the strength to walk two paths at the same time, all the way to the end.